The United Nations Security Council is meeting in New York to discuss Russian allegations that Ukraine is secretly operating biowarfare laboratories on behalf of the United States, something both countries have strongly denied. These are live pictures now coming out of New York City at the UN convening emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. Vasily Zebenzia, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, is now talking at that meeting. And, of course, this is an emergency meeting called by the Russian delegation, as they're entitled to, as one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Let's speak to Philip Ingram now, a former senior military intelligence officer and chemical weapons expert. Phil, thanks very much indeed for joining us. There's a lot to unpick here, but first of all, what do you make of this emergency meeting being called by the Russians in the first place?
Well, it's the Russians trying to enhance the stories that they've put out about this chemical weapons and the biological weapons development organizations that they've got. It's part of Russian doctrine. They've got a doctrine of maskirovka, which is masking, which is trying to throw disinformation out there to get people thinking in different ways. And it's usually done in a way as a precursor to false flag attacks and try and blame other people for what they do to themselves.
I mean, we've picked up a little of what Mr. Zebenzia has been saying so far, and some of it's included stories involving pathogens being spread by migratory birds. I mean, it's all quite confusing stuff. But do you think, by and large, this is a standard false flag move as a pretext for Russia itself to start engaging in using tactical weapons?
It is. It's a masking. You know, biological weapons are great in theory. They're great for scaring people. They're not an act of war. It's not a good military tool to use in any way, shape or form. A, they're very difficult to weaponize, biological agents, and B, they're even more difficult to control. So, if you engineer a virus to go out there, it's not just going to attack necessarily the enemy troops that you want. It can come back and hit you. So it's not used as weapons. These migratory birds, how do you then program them to fly just in the one direction that you want to? It can't happen. So it's a completely incredible claim.
Okay, chemical weapons, and let's talk about those for a second. They're citizens of Syrian cities and towns like Ghouta and Douma and others, Khan Sheikhoun, I'm thinking of as well. They did have chemical weapons launched at them. What were the effects of that, and how did the Russians, in those cases, use that, organise the pretext to use those weapons?
Well, this is where the worrying bit is. The Russians used a lot of disinformation to suggest that the rebels in Syria were firing chemical weapons on themselves, to try and blame Bashar al-Assad and the Russians for doing it. So again, it's that false flag piece that's there. But the Russian and Assad use of chemical weapons did break the deadlock in a lot of the cities very quickly indeed, because of the horrific nature of those sorts of weapons. Now, Russia has suggested and given the sort of the flag waving that this could happen in Ukraine, and that's why I think a lot of Western leaders are putting it out as a bit of concern, because so far Russia is following the same playbook that they did in Grozny in 2008 and in Syria afterwards. From my personal perspective, I think it would be very difficult for them to start to use chemical weapons in Ukraine, because they don't have this plausibly deniable outlet, which they did with Bashar al-Assad beforehand, and say, hey, wasn't us, it was him. They can't do that in Ukraine. There's nowhere to hide.
I mean, it was about 10 days ago when the Kremlin put out this nod and a wink that if people didn't play ball with them, things could get unimaginably worse. And that started this conversation in the Western countries about the possibility of nuclear strikes. Now, I think it's worth, isn't it, taking a moment, Philip, to look at the difference between strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons, and indeed tactical chemical weapons. They're very different issues there, aren't they?
Well, they are. Chemical weapons are all tactical. There's nothing really strategic in the use of those. The interesting thing and the interesting difference between strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons is strategic nuclear weapons are controlled by the international strategic treaties, the numbers of them and everything else. Tactical weapons aren't. So, and a lot of the delivery mechanisms that Russia is using to send normal conventional explosives into the cities of Ukraine and attack hospitals and attack centres of civilian population are the same platforms that can be used to put a nuclear warhead on them. Now, Putin has got an awful lot of things that he can do before he even needs to consider anything along the nuclear side of things. If he was going down that line, he'd probably engineer some form of nuclear incident, potentially around the old Chernobyl nuclear reactors, of which there's still some working reactors there. So something along that to get him started on that path. And again, we're hearing some discussion about potential false flagging, different pieces of information out there to suggest that they could do that. A lot of this is trying to wave his big stick at the West and at the Ukrainians to say, Ukrainians surrender, West back off. It's not going to work.
Philip Ingram, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today.
My pleasure.